As a local community college trustee from San Mateo County, I want to acknowledge my fellow San Mateo County residents. I know there are a couple here in the room, including Walter Johnson and Tom Edminster, who asked me to come here today. So I'll kind of run through some of the information that I think you probably know, but let me run through, what is the disaster we're facing today, kind of the short-term causes, and then sort of longer-term trends that I think brought us to the brink of disaster a couple of years ago, and now we've kind of gone off of that cliff, both in California and as a nation. And we know the numbers, but let me run through them. In 2006, California had a $100 billion general fund budget. That was about its maximum budget. Since then, what we've been enduring, in 2009, we had a $35 billion budget deficit. In 2010, an additional $20 billion budget deficit. And now we're being told the projection is another $28 billion state budget deficit over the next 18 months. And I was real proud in November, as a Californian, because it seemed like we did turn back that reactionary tide, at the Sierras, and elected liberal to progressive sweep, governor, U.S. Senate, all the constitutional officers, large majorities in both houses of the legislature. And it was a victory, but in a way it was a victory where we don't really get to enjoy the fruits of that victory. Because even though we, labor and progressive allies, were successful, remarkably successful in November, what are we now facing? We're now facing a budget announcement from our governor, which is just about more pain, more misery, more cuts, more sacrifice. And that's because of the rules that have been created in our state. Rules that don't require the other side to have to come to the table, because there's no sense that they could lose, that there are risks, that if things go to the brink, the anti-government, anti-tax folks stand to lose, because these rules insulate them from any kind of exposure to defeat. And we got to talk about how we change those rules around. But we're not, California is unique and we're not unique. We're not the only state. Every state is in a budget crisis or a budget disaster. You can look at states that have no public sector collective bargaining laws, and they're in the same boat that we're in. Just to mention a few states that have no public sector collective bargaining rights and that are facing 30% or greater budget deficits today. That includes Arizona, North Carolina, and Nevada. Those are three of the worst hit states that you can't turn around and say, gee, it's the greedy public employee unions, because there aren't any public employee unions that have any clout in those states. We're on the receiving end of a collapse in the entire structure of our economy, and how the federal government has dealt with that collapse by pushing the problems down to the state and local level. This is true under Republican and Democrat rule equally. The idea of federalism that came in with Reagan has continued to push all the problems down to the state and local level. But I think to talk about what we are facing, you have to look at long-term trends in terms of income distribution, income inequality, and what we are all facing in this nation. And I just want to recite a few facts that I'm sure you all are familiar with. In the past 3+ decades, let's say from 1974 through 2008, average U.S. income went up by $11,000, roughly $11,000. All of that gain went to the top 10%. The bottom 90% of Americans saw a decline in income over the past 34 years. Now, you could go back and look at, well, what happened before that? Between 1940 and 1974, saying 34, this is a 34-year snapshot, average income in the U.S. went up by $28,000. The top 10% got 27% of that growth in income, and the bottom 90% got 73% of the growth in income. Between 1947 and 1973, income growth for the bottom 20% of Americans was equal to income growth for the top 20% of Americans. So what we have seen is a massive shift since the mid-70s of wealth and income towards the very top. And it's not just the top 10%, it's the top 1/2 of 1%. Right now, we are about where we were at the start of the Great Depression. Every income group is being squeezed except for the top 1%. The growth in income of the top 1/2 of 1%, in the mid-60s they had about 6% of the wealth. Today they have 17%. The top 1% today has 27% of the wealth. So we're seeing a disparity that has not existed since the beginning of the Great Depression. We've seen a drop in productivity growth since the mid-70s. From the 40s to the 70s, the U.S. experienced rapid productivity growth. We had strong unions. We had movements for social justice, for low-income people, for people of color. And we had something in this country that was a pseudo-industrial policy. It's called the Pentagon, but in effect we had an industrial policy in the United States. Since then, we've seen a decrease in productivity growth, and the corporate answers to that decrease in growth and productivity has been to offshore jobs through globalization, through so-called free trade agreements, to take the good jobs out of the United States, to squeeze worker pay, to break unions, and to change the tax structure so that disproportionately more and more of the tax burden is falling on middle class and even lower income earners. And that's why we've seen this explosion in wealth at the very top and the shrinkage for everybody else. And while those were the corporate solutions, you know, what are working people doing? They're doing coping mechanisms to try to survive. First, more people entered the workforce. So what was the traditional one income earning family, you know, the nuclear family, became a two income earning family where nuclear families, you know, remained. And women entered the workforce in very large numbers, which for purposes of personal fulfillment is wonderful. For many people, it was for purposes of survival. People extended their hours, working more and more hours because hourly incomes are down. So by the late 90s, the average American family was working 9 additional weeks a year compared to what the average American family was working back in the 1960s. And then finally, when those solutions stopped working, we went into debt and used credit cards and then ultimately home mortgage values as a way of just trying to stay afloat until that bubble burst a couple of years ago. We are now, I think, at a point where conservative forces who have been successful in decimating the private sector labor movement see the moment of opportunity to destroy the public sector labor movement. And I can tell you as a local elected official, I talked to a lot of other local officials, and you know, yes, there is more and more talk about we got to deal with Prop 13. There's more and more talk about, you know, it's time to look at that 2/3 requirement, split roll for commercial tax. And those conversations are more out there than I've ever seen in the past. But let me tell you what's much more out there is public sector pensions. And that is what we've got to go after. I hear that over and over and over in San Mateo County, which is a reasonably liberal county, just talking to local government officials, elected officials, that this is what we have to tackle. And you can say, well, even if you tackle it, you won't see the results for a generation, because until people, first of all, nobody's being hired. Let's start with that. You know, so until people who are being hired are old enough to be retired, you're not going to see any significant change in the cost of those pensions. But that is the general direction of, I'd say, the bulk of the conversations. So I think we're at a moment where there is a huge risk that the conservative pro-business forces are going to achieve a long-term goal, and that is to destroy the public sector labor movement. And I would argue that part of what you have to do in fighting back is go beyond defending public employee unions. If we don't have a strong private sector labor movement, I don't think the public sector labor movement is going to do very well. We're all in this together, and as people are looking for either a solution or a scapegoat, we got to have numbers. We have to have critical mass among all Californians, among all Americans, in order to not have the target put on the public sector union and government services. So I would just suggest that part of what has to occur in figuring out an answer to this problem is support, funding, and whatever else is required to rebuild organized labor in the private sector as well. Just a very brief review of some of the structural issues that make California uniquely difficult. You can go back and start with Prop 13. Back in the 1930s, California did adopt a 2/3 budget requirement. This predates Prop 13. It was originally adopted with it wasn't an extreme 2/3 vote requirement. If the budget went up, I'm talking the state budget, went up by less than 5% a year, simple majority. If it was more than 5% a year, the 2/3 requirement kicked in. In the 1960s, that was changed. So the budget, 2/3 budget majority requirement for all budget approval in the state of California goes back to the 60s. It predates Prop 13, and that was just modified this November. But the big one, of course, 1978, Prop 13 established a 2/3 requirement for any tax increases at the local or state level, with a few loopholes that have been, I don't want to use the term loopholes, loopholes is one of those laden terms, with a few smart exceptions, okay, for local increases. But those exceptions were largely closed when Prop 218 was approved in 1996, and in effect, you have a 2/3 vote requirement at the state level and at the local level. The state level, 2/3 of the legislature; at the local level, 2/3 of voters to increase any tax, with very, very few exceptions. Now, in the year 2000, there was a positive step made, and that was the passage of Prop 39, and that reduced the 2/3 for school bonds to 55%. And there was a lot of polling done at that time, and what the polling found was voters have a softer, warmer feeling about schools, or greater commitment to schools than they do about other services. Okay. And they also have a greater willingness to fund buildings than what goes on inside those buildings. So they did reduce that it's a tangible. You feel my dollars are going to repair roofs rather than I don't know what goes on in the classroom. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of the problems. Very quickly, we had good and bad news just this past November. Prop 25 did create a simple majority for budget, but not for taxes. But Prop 26, which was a very reactionary measure, now requires a 2/3 vote to get any fee on a business activity. So oil pollution cleanup fees, for example, or fees on tobacco companies, which could be done through a simple majority, now require 2/3 majority that punches about another $1 billion hole into the budget immediately. So that's a little background in terms of what is unique and not unique about California. I would just, close by saying, I think we have a lot of reason to be optimistic. I mean, I look long-term view. We went, my parents went through the Depression. It took a few years of suffering before people stood up and started fighting back and won incredible victories. I think we're going through that few years of suffering. I think there will be that point where people stand up and fight back and win victories, and it takes leadership. I'm glad you're all here to help lead that. Thank you.